Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the fourth session of the Tri-County Winter Webinar Series. Today we have Marissa Schuh with us from the University of Minnesota Extension talking about garden insects. And before I turn it over to Marissa, I just wanted to remind you that if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any comments or want to chat with other participants, please use the chat function. And with that, Marissa, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Emily. Good evening, everybody. My name is Marissa Schuh. I'm with the University of Minnesota Extension, and I work across the state with vegetable farmers and horticulture professionals and gardeners around how we holistically manage all kinds of bugs and other things in the spaces we work in. So tonight, we're going to be talking about insects, we're talking about bugs, and all the different roles they can play, particularly in our yards and gardens. So we're not going to go like in depth on a ton of species of insects, but if you have one you're really interested in, pop that in the Q&A and I'll make sure we can like make a little pit stop in whatever bug is like grinding your gears. Happy to talk about them, but we'll be covering stuff really broadly tonight. So where are we going to go? When we think about insects, I first like to highlight they do so many interesting and random things throughout our world. So we'll just be talking, start off by just like getting to know generally who are insects, what kinds of things they do. We'll then start to think about insects as pests a little bit. So, what kind of characteristics do insects or pests have? What kind of damage do they do to the plant? Who are these pests? We'll move then into, so as we think about managing pests, we have to learn a little bit about them. So, as we start to find pests in our spaces, how do we identify those bugs well and quickly without losing our minds? And what do we want to learn about those pests so that we can manage them well? We'll then close out by some good stuff bugs do. So, as we are going about our lives in our outdoor spaces, we'll see some bugs that are pests, but we're also likely to see some bugs that are doing some good stuff. So, I'll do some introduction and how to recognize some of our really common good bugs we have in Minnesota's outdoor spaces. And again, pop Q&A, pop questions, comments in the chat whenever. Happy to talk about whatever bugs are bugging you guys. So, let's start out, introduce bugs a little bit. So when we talk about insects or bugs, we're talking about a really, really huge group of organisms that do all kinds of things. So here we have a pie chart, and what this pie chart shows is the proportion of different types of organisms that we have all across the planet. And the bigger the section of that pie chart, the more members of that group we have. So I don't know, maybe you're in these webinar series because you're like a plant person. You know, a lot of us are like avid gardeners. We like plants. Sorry, I'm like a bug person, but for perspective, we have about 250,000 different species of plants that have been discovered all across the world, and that represents maybe an eighth of our pie chart, an eighth-ish of our life on Earth is going to be plants. This tiny section of the pie chart here, this like 1/20th, those are going to be all our animals with backbones. So all of our birds and mammals and reptiles and dogs and cats and deers and fish, they all fall into this tiny little section of our, life on Earth pie chart. While our insects, they are more than half of our species of life on Earth. We've identified almost 1 million species of bugs, and depending on which expert you ask, scientists estimate there could be anywhere from like 1 to 7 million different species of insects found doing all kinds of things all around the world. Here's another way of looking at it. So this is that kind of same, like all the different kinds of life on Earth, but visualized as emojis. I'm an avid emoji user. Like I would talk through emoji hieroglyphics if I could. And so when you go into like your little emoji keyboard, you'll go to the animal section, you'll see like we have lots of our animals with backbones. And if we were trying to make these like emojis in our phone match that pie chart, we'd need this many bug emojis, over 1,000 bug emojis to make the emojis in our phone proportional to the different numbers of species of animals we have across the world. So many different species of bugs. And bugs can look all kinds of different ways. There's a huge diversity in our insects. We have some, broad groups we might recognize. We have things like our beetles, our wasps and bees, our flies, our mosquitoes, our butterflies and moths. We have dragonflies, grasshoppers, stink bugs, leafhoppers, all kinds of bugs. And I don't think it's important for us to be able to identify every kind of bug, but sometimes it's helpful for us to think about what different roles do bugs play in our spaces. And so when we think about insects, people oftentimes just jump to like insects are pests. And that's true. Some of our species of insects are pests. It's estimated that, of our million species all around the world, 1 to 7% of those species are pests. So that means the majority of the species that are living in our world that we're encountering maybe on a day-to-day basis are not pests. Either think of them being as kind of bystander bugs, they maybe eat plants, but not enough where they're a pest, or maybe they're actually a good bug where they help flowers get pollinated and make fruit, or they're predators of other insects that are pests, or they help us, clean up roadkill or inspire art. There's lots of bugs that do really, really helpful things that make ecosystems function as well as like human society function. So as we think about what makes an insect a pest, what makes an insect fall into this, 1 to 7% of species that makes it a pest, it's because it is an insect, or a pest could also be a plant or a mammal, something that does meaningful damage to stuff we care about. So in the garden, we're typically thinking about insects that cause meaningful damage to plants we care about. You'll sometimes hear people say a pest is a whatever out of place, a weed is a plant out of place, and sometimes a bug is just a bug in the wrong place. In other environments, that insect might not be a pest, but when it's chomping on a plant we really care about, then it might become a pest. So let's get to know some characteristics that a lot of our pest insects share. So, a lot of the reason that insects become pests is because of stuff people do. They become pests because they are doing something to a plant that people care about. So sometimes what we choose to grow and how we choose to grow them can like tilt the favor in a bug becoming a pest. So does anybody recognize like this big yellow bug over here? Do we have any vegetable gardeners in the chat? In our 44 participants tonight? Okay, so this is a bug called Colorado potato beetle. Super, super common pest in Minnesota. If you grow potatoes in Minnesota, this guy will probably show up. But this insect, for most of its, history on Earth, didn't know what potatoes were. As the name implies, Colorado potato beetle, originally from Colorado. And historically, it ate a species called buffalo burr, which is kind of like this tough, thistly plant. As the United States was settled, we started growing different things here, including potatoes. And Colorado beetle happened to discover that it like loves eating potatoes. After a lifetime of eating like this gnarly, spiky, tough burr, potatoes are probably like a huge upgrade to like the dining experience of this particular bug. So they discover, thanks to humans, something they love to eat. And then bonus, people when they grow potatoes tend to grow a lot of it. It's all of a sudden you have your new favorite food. It is everywhere. And you can really grow your populations when it has very easy access to a food source that you totally love. So sometimes the way we grow stuff makes insects become pests. In the case of some of our invasive species, one of the big reasons they become pests is because they aren't really well integrated into our food webs. So I think, I don't know, maybe back to high school biology where we have, all these different organisms in our environment. They have all these relationships to each other where they're eating or being eaten and they're all connected. And so for a lot of our invasive pests, in the places where they're from, they're integrated into their food webs. So let's think about Japanese beetle, who's been really wrecking some lawns across the metro area the last 5 years. So as the name implies, this is a beetle from Japan. And if you look at the literature on this particular bug in Japan, they're kind of a nobody bug. They're occasionally mentioned as like a pest in golf courses in one region of Japan. That's because they're from Japan. There are things that eat Japanese beetle there. There are things that make Japanese beetles sick there. When Japanese beetle shows up in Minnesota, it's not integrated into the food web. We don't have things that co-evolved with Japanese beetle that grew up eating Japanese beetle. There's not things that make Japanese beetle sick, and that allows that insect to kind of grow its population unchecked. Some of our insects only become pests when the environmental conditions are right. So maybe not quite this year, but maybe 2020 through 2023, we had some pretty dry summers. And I got a lot of emails from people being like, why are there so many grasshoppers? This feels like the little house on the prairie book where there's like a swarm of locusts. There's so many grasshoppers. It feels like that. So this drought monitor this is where we're at the end of the 2023 gardening season. The more dark red your area is, the more droughty it is. And so for grasshoppers, they're an insect that is much more likely to grow its numbers and become a pest when the environmental conditions are right. The primary way that grasshopper populations are controlled in Minnesota is that when it rains a lot, especially in the spring, grasshoppers get sick with this fungus. So if we have a wet spring, a lot of those baby grasshoppers die and we have lower populations. If we have a really dry spring and dry summer, that fungus isn't around. So because of those dry conditions, grasshoppers can have a much easier life. Their populations get bigger and they're more likely to become a pest. Going back to stuff that people do, sometimes the way we try to manage pests actually makes them worse. So we'll go back to our Colorado potato beetle example. So when you think about insects, sometimes, our Colorado potato beetle, he looks like this, big, yellow, black stripes, but that's not the way he always looks. Depending on how old insects are and where they're at in their life cycle, they can look totally different and feed on totally different plants. So in the case of Colorado potato beetle, sometimes it looks like a beetle. Those beetles lay eggs, which are smaller than the adult beetles, don't move. Those hatch, a big fat orange grub comes out. That grub eats and eats and eats. It goes under the soil and has this kind of in between pupa stage and then emerges an adult. And so, as we think about how we manage Colorado potato beetle, a lot of times people feel like they're putting a lot of effort into managing this specific bug, but also lots of others. And their management actions aren't actually doing anything and actually making the pest problem worse. So, for example, with Colorado potato beetle, this is an insect that farmers and gardeners have used a lot of pesticides on. And pesticides can be an effective tool to help manage this bug, but they aren't always. A lot of our insecticides are only capable for this bug of killing the larva. So we can use a ton of chemicals on the adults, but those chemicals are really unlikely to do anything to the adults. So the fact that we think we're doing a really good job managing them, but we're not actually, kind of allows their populations to keep growing in all these sneaky ways. This can lead to insects becoming resistant to different products. So, in any population of bugs, there's little mutations happening all the time. The bug with a mutation, he doesn't even know, he doesn't even know he's a mutant until all of a sudden that mutation helps them be better at life. So, here we have a visualization of what insecticide resistance looks like. So, we'll say on the surface, all these bugs look exactly the same, but our bug in red, he has this little mutation in him that, for whatever reason, allows him to survive a pesticide. He might never even know he has that gene unless, him and his buddies get sprayed. They get sprayed. He lives. Maybe two of his other friends were like out to lunch when the spray happened. They don't get sprayed, so they live. They commingle. They bring about the next generation of beetles. And that next generation is going to have that mutation in an even higher percentage of the population. So to use the same products over and over again, we can like select accidentally for insects with insecticide resistance. So this sounds really abstract and maybe like something that only happens when people from a university are talking about bugs, but this is super, super real. In the case of Colorado potato beetle, for whatever reason, this insect mutates a lot and is really good at coming up with new resistances. It's resistant to over 50 different kinds of insecticides just because of how people have tried to manage this bug. So, okay, insects can become pests through all these different types of ways. When we're thinking about pests in the garden, how are they actually damaging our plants? For most of our insect pests, they're damaging the plant as they feed. And this is, okay, let's see if they go. Oops. Okay, there we go. So insects can have different types of mouth parts. That's going to determine what they eat. So our insects who are plant pests typically have one of two types of mouth parts. Chewing mouth parts, where the insects have little jaws that they use to chew up a leaf. So here we have a caterpillars. Those guys have chewing mouth parts. In this guy's case, he can use that chewing mouth part to completely eat this looks like dill or asparagus to me. Totally eat that leaf. We have other insects who have what's called a piercing and sucking mouth part. I think of this mouth part as being almost like a straw, where they can stick that straw into a plant and suck out plant juices. So this damage isn't always as obvious because it doesn't look like a hole in the leaf the way our chewing insects leave behind. These guys oftentimes make things look spotty or puckered or discolored. And so a stink bug, as we see here, would be an example of an insect with a piercing, sucking mouth part. So here we can see an example of an insect mouth part, an insect, maybe a pest at work. We have a grasshopper. These are insects with a chewing mouth part. And again, I don't know. This is like the entomologist in me speaking. I always think it's super cool, but also kind of freaky when you get up close and see all those different parts of that chewing mouth part, making quick work of whatever kind of plant this is. So one thing to note about our plant pests is that the pests oftentimes are not new to plants. Plants evolved being eaten by stuff. Plants are used to being eaten. And so plants can be eaten by bugs, and it might not actually be that bad for the plant potentially. So here we have 3 leaves. And what we did with these leaves is they were once whole. We scanned them, gave them to a bug. The bug ate however much it's going to eat. We take the leaf back, scan it again, and then we can use computer programs to compare those before and after images to get a more exact percentage of how much that insect ate. So if you guys just want to pop in the chat, we'll look at our first What, this would be on your left, I believe. I don't think there's any weird mirror happening. We're looking at the least eaten leaf. Anybody just want to pop in the chat what percentage of this leaf we think whatever hungry bug has eaten? Okay, thank you to our brave chatters. We have anywhere it looks like from a thing anywhere from 2 to 10%. So that's about 5%. So even at this small amount, it's very easy to like our eyes sometimes are not the best at estimating what's actually going on. How about our middle leaf here? Anybody want to pop into the chat here what they think is what percentage we're going on here? Okay, I'm seeing some higher stuff, 30, 50, 15, 40, 45, one third. Okay, so we're getting a little higher. This is 20% damage. Got our last raggedy leaf over here. Any guesses on this one? Okay, we're landing somewhere it looks like between 50 and 80 is where most of our guesses are landing here. This is 30% damage. So again, stuff can look horrible to us, but it might not be that bad and it might not matter that much to the plant. So this is an example taken from soybeans. All those were soybean leaves. So soybean is a plant that we grow millions of acres of in Minnesota. Maybe some like of you guys live next door to soybean fields. And we know from studying that plant that this is a plant where our goal is like yield. We're trying to grow as much soybeans as possible. And from studying that particular plant, we know we only need to do something about pests when we're seeing 20 to 30% of the leaf area being consumed. If we're seeing, 5% damage, 16% damage, we know from studies that the costs of the insecticide and our time and the farmer like driving the tractor around to use an insecticide, that cost is greater than the yield loss that you're seeing when there's only 20% or less of the leaf being consumed. So, in our garden, we're not, maybe we're farmers, but most of us aren't growing for like maximum yield all the time. But I still think it's helpful to remember that plants can be eaten and we can still get, the tomatoes we want, the beautiful blooms we want, the healthy trees we want, that there can still be some insect damage happening and we can still get productive, healthy, beautiful gardens. There are some other sneaky ways insects can damage plants beyond just feeding. So, do we have anybody who likes to grow like raspberries in here? Any raspberry enthusiasts in the chat tonight? Maybe yes, I have a raspberry bush, a much neglected raspberry bush in my own backyard. And in the last 20 years, it's become much harder to grow raspberries in Minnesota because of an invasive insect called spotted winged Drosophila, who we got pictured here. So this is a fruit fly who's a little bit different than maybe the fruit flies that are like hanging out in your kitchen right now because you bought some overripe bananas at Cub Foods. So these most of our fruit flies can only lay their eggs in fruit that is already super soft. I see someone mentioning their dog is a horrible pest. Yes, my dog is also my garden's worst pest. Okay, back to spotted winged Drosophila. So most of our fruit flies are only able to lay their eggs in fruit that is overripe and mushy. This new insect, spotted winged Drosophila, is able to lay its eggs in ripe fruit. So it's this active, a modified egg layer that allows them to lay their eggs in ripe fruit that is really makes it much harder to grow raspberries and strawberries and some of our other soft-bodied fruits here in Minnesota. We have other insects who the way they're a pest is by spreading disease. So here we have an aphid. This is an insect with a piercing, sucking mouth part. And for some of our insects with that straw mouth part, they can, go and move from plant to plant and feed on many plants in the course of their life. And just like people, our plants can get sick. So here we have tomatoes. This is not like a hot new tie-dye tomato variety. This is a tomato with a plant virus. So instead of, I don't know, it's not like when we get the flu, we get the sniffles and a cough. When a tomato gets a virus, its DNA goes crazy and it produces tomato fruit that look like this and don't taste good. And the way this virus gets from tomato plant to tomato plant is it hitches a ride inside the aphid. So the aphid's moving along and it sticks its little straw into a plant that has the virus in it. It then sucks up the plant juices, and in those juices is the virus. The aphid then moves on to the next plant. And I almost think of it as like when you drink from a straw and there's like backwash. Like as the aphid is feeding on this next plant, it accidentally does a little backwash, and that virus now is in another plant. So some of our insects can spread plant disease by accident. But again, when we're thinking about pests, this is only a small portion of are total insects, and only a, like there's a lot more insects that do good and important things. Let's talk about those a little bit. So when we think about insects, we have insects who use their chewing and piercing and sucking mouth parts for ill. They use it to harm our plants. We also have insects with those same type of mouth parts who use them to be predators. They use those mouth parts to feed on other insects. They can actually help us manage pests. So here we have an aphid, so that, little straw backwash guy. That's what they look like in real life. Does anybody want to pop in the chat? Anybody know what this larger gray kind of alligatory looking insect is? Any guesses? Does anyone know this guy? Lady beetle. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jackie. So just like how a caterpillar doesn't really look anything like a butterfly, a baby ladybug looks like this. Doesn't really look anything like the adult ladybug. But what's nice about ladybugs is that both the baby and the adult ladybugs are super, super hungry predators. These guys, before they even become adults, can eat a couple hundred aphids, and then once they're adults, adult ladybugs can eat 1,000 aphids. Here we have an example of a predator insect with a piercing and sucking mouth part. So just, I showed you a few slides ago, a stink bug feeding on a plant. Here we have a stink bug, same piercing, sucking mouth part, but here it's using it to spear and suck the juices out of, in this case, a caterpillar. So even within one group of insects, even within, stink bugs, we have pest stink bugs and we have helpful stink bugs. So this can seem a little abstract. We're talking about tiny bugs eating other tiny bugs, but this is actually super, super valuable. One economic analysis of the value of insects eating other insects, something scientists call biological control, estimated the economic impact of this service that insects provide at 4.5 billion, yes, billion with a B, dollars a year of free pest control provided by insects. Insects are also super important pollinators. So when we're talking about pollination, we're talking about the act of moving pollen, which is that yellow stuff on flowers that contains the genetic material of that plant. It needs to move from one member of the species to another in order for that plant to produce fruit and to produce seeds. So a huge amount of our flowering plants rely on some type of pollinator, and most of those pollinators are insects. So here we can just have a visualization of like how important is this pollination, is insects moving, little yellow powder from one plant to another. Super valuable. Here we have a visualization done by a grocery store where the top left is, how we might expect the grocery store to look if you're going to hop in after work and pick something up. Down here we have that same grocery store, but they've removed anything from that section that needed bees to be there. So we can see a lot of the fruits and vegetables that we love to eat, all of our apples, all of our berries, a lot of our vegetables, at some point in their life cycle need some type of insect to help move that pollen around. So we're going to take like a little pollinator pit stop now because this is a group of bugs that a lot of people are pretty excited about in Minnesota. So when we talk about pollinators, we're talking about a lot of different types of insects. Yes, we have things like bats and hummingbirds that move pollen around, but primarily we're talking about bugs. And this can be things like moths and butterflies and beetles, and even some bugs we don't like. Like I recently saw a paper that said like wasps can actually do a ton of pollination. But generally, the insect that like evolved to pollinate are going to be our bees. And bees are a much larger and more diverse group than a lot of people might think. When we think bee, we might think yellow, fuzzy, black stripes, has a queen, makes honey. And while we do have species of bees who do that, we have way more species of bee that don't live like that and don't look like that. So across the United States, we have 3,600 species of bees, and only a small portion of the ones are ones that are social, meaning that they live in a hive and live together. Our yellow and black stripes, the bees we recognize as bees, just like ring the little bee alarm in our head, very small portion of our total number of bee species. In Minnesota, we have about 525 species of bees. Honeybees are one species. We have maybe 10 species of bumblebees. The rest of our species of bees in Minnesota are what we usually call solitary bees. So they can be yellow with black stripes, but a lot of them aren't. They're oftentimes small, oftentimes black or metallic-y blue or green. And again, they're solitary. They live alone. So 70% of our, solitary bees are what we call ground nesting bees, which is basically, I think this is being like like a little single mom bee living in a hole in the ground and raising a little bee family. So what these guys are looking for is a little patch of ground. It could be gravel or sand or bare ground or even turf, looking for a little patch of ground. Once they find one they like, as the name implies, they build a nest, which essentially is a hole in the ground. For many species, we're talking about a hole that is like 6 to 8 inches deep, though some species of these bees have been documented digging holes that are like 3 feet deep. So for many species, they dig a main tunnel and then they dig a bunch of side tunnels. They then go out, visit flowers, they pollinate the flowers, they eat some of the nectar that flowers make, but they also bring some of that pollen back and they put a little ball of pollen at the end of each of those tunnels. The fancy entomological name of this is bee bread. Learning that little piece of jargon was like almost worth my entomology degree. That's some good terminology we invented. So, little ball of pollen, this little ball of pollen, this bee bread. She lays an egg on it. That egg hatches. The baby bee comes out. It eats that pollen until it turns into this in between pupa stage and hangs out into that hole until the next year. So I think about our ground nesting bees. I get a lot of questions that I talk about these guys like, this sounds nice. Like I like pollinators, but aren't these guys like the wasps I find in my sandbox that are going to harass me and my family? And the answer is no. So our solitary bees, they live alone. Again, think like single mom. It is not to her advantage to get after you and attack you and hurt herself in the process. Because if she dies, there's no one else to go out and collect pollen and raise this little family. And that is in stark contrast to our ground nesting wasps, who, if we were to like look under the hood of what's going on in that ground nesting wasp hive, there's thousands and thousands of wasps living underground in that hive. And these wasps live in this kind of um, social, like, I will give my life for the good of the hive. The individual wasps, they don't care if they die protecting their hive because they know they have thousands of sisters to continue their life's work if they happen to get in a fight with you and die in the process. So usually we're not even going to notice that our solitary ground nesting bees are around because, again, tiny holes with like really one bug is actively living there, as opposed to our ground nesting wasps, we have thousands of bugs. So if you're noticing a hole at all, it's much more likely to be one of our ground nesting wasps. If there's traffic, it's probably a wasp, not going to be one of our bees. The remaining 30% of our most of our bees in Minnesota are what we call stem nesting bees. So if you've ever seen a bee hotel or put out a bee hotel, those little cute little wooden houses with like bamboo sticks in them, they aim at providing habitat for this type of bee. So these guys have a similar solitary thing going, but instead of living in the ground, we're talking about a single female bee making a nest in a hollow stem. So these guys, every spring, they go out and they look for holes in wood or dead plant stems or like the what you've left kind of like trimmed after you trim away your perennials. They're looking for that. Once they find a stem they like, they collect pollen, build that ball of food, lay an egg, and then they go out and they collect more leaves and they cap it off. And they repeat this cycle over and over again until that stem is full of baby bees. Okay, so that was like our little pollinator corner. If you have any more pollinator questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. But we're gonna talk about some other cool things bugs do. Well, maybe you guys won't think this is cool, but insects are super important in our big beautiful world, not being full of like dead animals and rotten fruit and like garbage. Insects break down all that gnarly stuff, stinky stuff in the environment and help turn it into soil and nutrients and useful stuff. So insects are really important in breaking down stuff like roadkill. Insects are super important in moving and breaking down animal poop. I saw a study that estimated that just in Texas, the value of dung beetles, so beetles that move around and break down poop, that's worth thousands of dollars. Just the act of tiny beetles moving around poop because they're breaking down the poop. The farmers don't have to do it. The beetles are doing it for them. Insects are also, again, entomological bias here, but there's a lot of really cool art and culture that has been inspired by the stuff and the life cycles of bugs. And I think this lens of appreciation can be a little bit helpful, especially when it feels like bugs drive us a little buggy sometimes. So now we're gonna leave, I don't know, this highfalutin, all the cool things bugs do. Let's get down to nuts and bolts. There's bugs in my space. How do I decide if I should squish them or not? So anytime we're trying to make a decision about what we want to do about a bug in the space, making an attempt at ID is going to be our first step. Especially if we're going to invest time and money in managing that bug. If we don't have a good ID, it's really unlikely that we're going to choose the right thing to do. So, how do we identify bugs? Lots of different potential routes, especially with the magic of the internet. So, a great place to start is the University of Minnesota Extension webpage. And I'm not just saying that because I work there and I'm biased. But what's nice about the University of Minnesota webpage is that we have tons of pages on insects commonly seen in Minnesota. And that is an undervalued part of this. Yes, you can search Google for like, I saw an orange beetle with black stripes, but you will find all kinds of stuff on the internet about whatever this bug may or may not be. It almost feels like when you like have a headache and you go to WebMD and you come away from it being like, oh, I'm going to die tomorrow. Like sometimes a Google search with bugs will lead you in a similar direction where you fall down this Google hole and you become convinced you've like found this horrible invasive species, but more likely it is just a bug we commonly see in Minnesota. So starting with a local source can be really helpful in narrowing the search quickly and keeping your anxiety levels down. For some common groups of plants, so for example, all of our vegetable plants, we have pages that just cover you're growing squash in your garden. Here are the 5 insects you're probably going to see at some point in your squash. That can be a quick thing you can like scan before you even plant your squash so that those bugs will instantly ring a bell when they inevitably show up during the growing season. But you're not limited to extension tools. There are all types of tools that can help people with all types of binds and workflows figure out how to identify bugs. I'm very partial, again, big asterisks, I am a bug freak, to this book, Garden Insects of North America. If you are someone who is very bug curious or has a bug curious person in your life, this is a great Christmas gift. But it's nice because it sorts insects by the types of ways they interact with plants, and it has tons of full color pictures for garden insects that you will see in North America. So if you're a bug fanatic, great resource. There's also a lot of different apps and even like new AI tools that can potentially be helpful in identifying insects. One big asterisk I will put besides apps and things that use AI to look at pictures is look at the stuff you get from those as a starting point and not as definitive. So maybe you use the app or you use the AI and the AI on the picture you took and feed it through Google. Use that as a starting point. I'm going to look at the top 5 answers and do a little bit more research to see if any of these are reasonable. Don't take whatever the first thing it spits out as like 100% right because it's hard to take pictures of bugs and these apps aren't always that smart. So use a little bit of your own logic when you're using any of these online tools. Okay, so big takeaway, brush up on insect ID before you do stuff and find a resource you like to use. Because again, there's lots of different stuff out there. Some people are book people, some people are app people. There's probably something that will work for you. Okay, so we've found an insect, we've identified it, and we've decided it is an insect we want to do something about. We want to manage it in some way. So the first instinct might be like, I'm going to like mix together some soap and some water that I read about in social media and spray that on the bug. Before we do that, we want to understand the insect a little bit because insects have complex lives and ways they move through our worlds. And the better we understand that, the better we can manage them. So when we think about insects and the way they look at different times of years, they can look totally different and be doing totally different things. And that might impact how we want to manage them in our space. So when you think about insects, they have different types of life cycles. They're not quite like us, where it's like there's a baby that looks essentially like a small adult and eventually they become an adult. It's not always that straightforward for bugs. So for insects, they do metamorphosis. So they almost like a snake, they shed their skin, and when they come out of their old skin, they can look the same, just bigger, or they can look different. So some of our insects have what we call complete metamorphosis. So this means that there are 4 distinct life stages that don't look anything like each other, might not hang out with each other at all, might not be interested in the same plants at all. So we have an adult. This adult could be a butterfly or a beetle or a fly or a wasp. Those would all be examples of insects with complete metamorphosis. The goal of the adults portion of their life generally is to move around, find a mate, and lay eggs. Once they lay eggs, those eggs need some temperature. They need some time to kind of sit and cook in the environment. Once they're laid, they need to be outside and be warm for a little bit. Once they've been exposed to enough warmth, a larva hatches out. And this could look like a caterpillar or a grub or a maggot. Those would be common examples of this larval stage that maybe you know from gardening or fishing. I feel like I got all my maggot experience from fishing as a kid. And the main goal of this larval part of their life stage is to eat as much as possible. This is a stage of their life that is very likely that an insect is a pest because larvae are basically eating machines, eating specialists. So they eat and grow until eventually they've been outside long enough, they've had enough heat, they've had enough food, and then they turn into a pupa. This could look like a chrysalis or cocoon would be other names for this pupa stage. This pupa stage doesn't move, and we don't even understand what happens inside of a pupa to make, go from looking like a caterpillar into a butterfly. All kinds of wild things are happening inside of this pupa, but eventually the adult will emerge and that cycle will start over again. This is in contrast to some of our other insects who have what's called incomplete metamorphosis. For this one, we also have an adult. This could look like a grasshopper or a stink bug or a box elder bug. So these guys move, they do some eating, and they lay eggs. Those eggs hatch, and out of that comes a nymph. And so these nymphs, they look like the adults, just tiny. The main differences are they don't have wings, so they can't fly, and they can't lay eggs. So these nymphs, they kind of grow, and then they molt, and then they grow, and then they molt until they finally have their wings. They're sexually mature, and they're able to restart that life cycle all over again. So here we have some visual examples of some insects with this complete life cycle. So things like a monarch butterfly, where we have eggs we don't see, we have caterpillars who eat and grow and eat and grow and turn into a butterfly. Japanese beetle would be another example of an insect with a complete life cycle, where for part of the year, Japanese beetle looks like this big, juicy white grub, feeding on our lawns. And for part of the year, Japanese beetle is this shiny green and brown beetle that is eating, it feels like, any plant it can find. I think an example many people are familiar with for an incomplete life cycle would be box elder bug. I don't know if any of you guys have there are just some houses that just feel like doomed to have box elder bug problems. And sometimes you'll just be looking at this swirl of box elder bugs and you'll see, I recognize these guys. They're black with kind of the red stuff on their body, but who are all these little red guys? I have like two species of insects that are harassing my house. No, you just have adult box elder bugs and these nymph box elder bugs. They look a little bit like the adults, they feed on the same stuff as the adults, and they all kind of like to hang out together. So, how does this help us figure out how we should manage bugs? For all these types of insects, there are going to be some parts of its life cycle where it's a pest and other parts of its life cycle where it isn't. So to really understand that full life cycle, we're able to figure out when is this insect most likely to be a pest and when is it most susceptible to different types of management actions I could take. So here we have an example of an invasive insect called spongy moth. If you're guess we're in Northwest Metro, but this is an insect that we mostly see right now, like along the North Shore. And this insect is a pest because during its larval phase, so during its caterpillar stage, where it's just a super hungry, goal is to eat, these guys can have huge numbers that can defoliate an entire tree. So we might need to think about, oh, to manage this bug, the best thing we can do is do something to keep the larvae from eating. And that can help us. But if we expand and think about what other stuff this bug is doing, we have way more potential management options. So, for example, we know this insect spends the winter as a big spongy egg mass on the side of trees. And so, if people know what these egg masses look like, they're pretty unique. We can have people who are out hiking in the fall or snowshoeing. If you see these, scrape them off the tree. We'll get rid of the eggs. We won't even have to deal with the hungry larvae at all. Be one example. And each pest is a little bit different, which makes it a little bit frustrating. It's never quite a one and done when you're trying to manage insects well, because each pest will have a different life cycle, different plants it likes, different places it hangs out, and that makes things tricky. So let's talk about, a couple different pests that highlight how different our pests are from each other. So I'll come back to aphids. I think this is their third shout out tonight. And that is because aphids are getting so much attention because they're a very common pest, especially when we have hot, dry summers. So aphids, there's a ton of different species of aphids. It feels like for almost every single plant, there's some aphid species that loves feeding on and harassing that plant. They're really small, so they're easy for us to accidentally miss until they have a huge population. And one of the reasons aphids are able to have such a huge population is because they do something almost no other insect does, which is give live birth. So, how aphid colonies often start is we have one female aphid who ends up on a plant, and she has the unique ability to essentially give live birth to clones of herself. So, for aphids, it can be the case where literally one aphid in a week or two can become dozens of aphids. Sorry, I should have done graphic aphid birth upcoming, but I mean look, the baby aphid is so looks like a little aphid puppy. It's cute, but kind of a menace on our plants. Again, when those baby aphids become fully grown, they can create more clones. So if we're thinking about aphids are a common pest, we're going to want to learn about aphids. We're going to want to know they're small and they like it hot and dry. So anytime we're having droughty conditions, I should be keeping an extra close eye on my plants with a history of aphid problems so that I can find those aphids early. Another nice thing about aphids, maybe one of the only nice things about aphids is that they're small and they're numerous, but they're not that strong. Like the reason they're so common when it is dry is because the act of rainfall can like knock them off the plant and kind of ruin their life. So even like shooting them with a hose can help keep their numbers in check. Another nice thing about aphids is that other bugs love to eat them. They're like a delicious green skittle. Lots of our predator bugs would be very happy to eat a diet of mostly aphids. So sometimes they're not even going to become a pest if we have other bugs in our space who can help keep our local aphid populations in check. So that's one type of pest. But if we're thinking about something like Japanese beetle, this is a much more tricky pest to manage in many ways because there are multiple parts of its life cycle where it's a pest, and it has all these different places that it hides out during the year that helps it survive. So if we think about Japanese beetle, we might be used to thinking about the shiny adult beetles in the summer, but this time of year they're actually surviving the winter as grubs, and these grubs are living under turf. Once they start to sense it getting cold out, they'll dig really deep into the soil, like 6 to 8 inches. And once they're down there, they're pretty well insulated. It takes a lot of really, really cold weather with really, really minimal snow for these grubs to get killed during the winter. So, unfortunately for Minnesota, these guys are pretty good at surviving in Minnesota winter. Once they get that signal that things are warming up, they're going to crawl back into the top few inches of the soil, feed on grass roots, then pupate, and the adult beetles will come out. These beetles are going to eat and mate and lay eggs and eat and mate and lay eggs. Those eggs hatch, and we're going to have grubs in our turf, like from mid-July on. And so for managing a pest like this, there's a lot more windows where this guy is a pest. He can be a pest in our turf in both like late summer, early spring, and the adults can be a pest basically whenever they are out. Japanese beetles also highlight a tricky bits of identification because while they spend the winter looking like this big white grub, there are lots of species in Minnesota who look like a big white grub. And sometimes we have to do really finicky, tricky ID. Emily, do you ID Japanese beetles? Is this
Yeah.
something people can get help with from you?
Yes.
Sweet. Yeah, because I don't know. This is like one of the more debasing tasks I feel like I have to do as an entomologist. Like to identify a Japanese beetle, you have to like look at a pattern of hairs essentially on their butt. So extension can be a great resource if you're like, I need to identify this this white grub. Is it a Japanese beetle? Can you help me figure out the specific pattern of hairs on the end of this beetle? So if we're thinking about managing this bug above ground, an important thing to understand is how they gather in such high numbers on our plants. They do something that a lot of other insects do, is that they release an aggregation pheromone, is what it's called. It's basically like once they find a plant they like, they send out a smell that all their friends can smell, and when their friends smell it, it says them like, "Oh, I'm gonna go over to Bobby's rose bush because it smells really good over there. I'm getting this smell that he's like having a really good time." So once one Japanese beetle lands and starts feeding on your plant, he's going to emit a smell that tells all his friends in the neighborhood, like, "Come on over. This plant's really great." So that's how one Japanese beetle can quickly become like a dozen Japanese beetles. So if we understand that, that highlights to us that once we start to see a Japanese beetle on our plant, we're going to want to remove it to keep this kind of out of control smell-based beetle party situation from happening on our plants. Okay, I'm going to hop past trapping, but if you guys want to talk about trapping, we can circle back to this because that's another smell-based thing. Okay, so that was just two pests, aphids and Japanese beetle, but I think that highlights how different two different pests can live totally different lives and have different management tactics associated with them. But a lot of the time, you might be identifying your insect and discover it's fine that this insect is here. It doesn't eat the plant that much, or maybe it's actually a helpful bug. And there's a lot of helpful bugs that we can find in all types of spaces. So we took, our little pollinator pit stop. A lot of people know what bees are and the good they do, but there are so many other insects that do good stuff. So we're going to spend our last 15-ish minutes here learning about helpful bugs we might discover in our space and the good work that they can do. So the first group of good bugs we're going to talk about are called ground beetles. So these are, as the name implies, insects that oftentimes live on the ground. So anytime you see like a dark, shiny, skittering beetle, likely to be a ground beetle. I feel like I see these guys the most when I'm like walking my dog in the summer and I see like a black shiny beetle skitter across the sidewalk, probably a ground beetle. So this is a very large group of beetles, but one thing they do that is really helpful is that they are they're hungry. And so they eat other bugs like caterpillars and slugs and maggots, but they also eat seeds, in particular the seeds that weeds drop. So if your garden's like mine and you got a little bit lazy and you had a big weed problem, these beetles want to help you manage their weed problem. They want to eat those seeds and those weeds left behind at the end of the season and keep those weeds from coming back next year. So these guys have a chewing mouth part. And again, super active, voracious predators. Here we have, I guess, like trigger warning, like insect on insect violence for the rest of this talk. Here we have a ground beetle eating a caterpillar. This would be a corn earworm, a common pest of, as the name implies, corn. A insect we're much less likely to notice in our spaces, but is also super hungry and aggressive, are called lacewings. So these guys, not as shiny, not as maybe as charismatic as bees or beetles, but really, really common. The adults lace are where they get their name from. Lacewings, they have these long, delicate, lacy looking wings. You're likely to see the adults by lights at night. I guess apparently I'm realizing all my experiences noticing bugs are linked to my habits around my dogs. But whenever I let my dogs out at night, I'm sitting by my back porch and I have the light out, I see these lacewings that are attracted to the light. So the adults mostly eat stuff from flowers, but they don't always look like this. These guys have an immature form that looks like this. So they're small, kind of reptilish, and they have these huge honking jaws. Like they almost look like pincers or something. And they use those jaws to eat other insects. They're very aggressive feeders of things like scales and aphids. So here's what our life cycle looks like for this bug. We have our adults who can be green or brown. They mostly eat flowery stuff. These adults lay eggs. And sometimes these eggs, for some species, are laid on these long silks. And they do this because these guys are hungry when they hatch. And so these silks help keep whoever hatches first from eating all of its siblings. That silk is enough to confuse them and make them leave the area so that the oldest sibling doesn't eat all 30 of its younger siblings. Once they hatch, really small. This here we have it next to a penny. So a really small bug, but a really hungry bug. So here we have a lacewing larva eating aphids. So we can see it's kind of clasping those aphids with its huge pincer-like jaws, sucking the juice out, and then it will move on to this little puppy baby aphid. But again, super hungry bug, common in Minnesota. We just might not be used to seeing it. We might have never noticed it before. Going even smaller, we have an insect called minute pirate bug. So these guys are small, like less than 5 millimeters in size. They kind of have this black and white tuxedo look. They have that piercing, sucking mouth part that they use to feed on other insects. Oftentimes, people notice these guys in the fall because as all their food they like to eat dies, sometimes they accidentally lay on us and they probe us. We get stuck with that straw-like mouth part, but they don't. The bite, the bites hurt, but they're not gonna like make us sick or anything. And whenever it happens to me, I'm just like, well, at least this guy was in my garden all summer long, managing pests for me. Um, I'm sorry, those guys are too small. They don't have any videos of them eating stuff. Speaking of insects that are do good work but are tricky to love, let's talk a little bit about wasps, in particular our social wasps. So are things like hornets and yellow jackets and paper wasps. So yes, these guys are a menace in the fall, but they spend the spring and the summer hunting. Primary diet most of that time of year is protein, and that protein comes primarily from other bugs. These guys are really active hunters of things like caterpillars and maggots. So here we have one of our social wasp species that is attacked and killed a cabbage caterpillar. So social wasps do good stuff, but they are hard. They're a hard bug to love and to make peace with. And if we think about why they're like this, it's because of the structure of their lives and how they live. So think about our wasps and our hornets and our yellow jackets. Generally, the only members of those species who survive the winter are going to be the queens. The queens find somewhere protected to hunker down and they spend the winter there. All the workers, the ones that we run into, they die every winter and come from a queen starts a new hive. So the queens, they go out, they will mate in the fall, hang out all winter, emerge in the spring, and they'll start a hive. So each of like the ginormous wasp hives that we might find like hanging under our porch in the fall starts with literally one wasp who starts to build up a population of workers. And these workers, they take care of the queen, they raise the young, and they spend a lot of the summer going out and hunting. So again, they spend the summer looking for protein, which they might scavenge from roadkill, but they're also pretty happy to eat other bugs, a lot of whom are pests. So they go out, they bring those back to the nest, they feed those to the young. The young, they squirt out the sugary substance that the adults eat. It's kind of this little protein for sugar exchange that's going on inside of that wasp hive. And these guys are good hunters and they can hunt a lot. Some wasp species are much smarter than we give them credit for. There's some really interesting work that's been shown that wasps can teach each other. If they find a large population of caterpillars, they can tell each other where they're at. There's even been studies that have shown that some species of wasps, if they find something like tent caterpillars, those caterpillars who you see them and they've like taken a sapling and they've covered it in silk and there's like this writhing mass of caterpillars and poop on the plant. Maybe you've ever run into tent caterpillars and like I'm very happy for if you haven't, but if you have, there are species of wasp that have been documented where one wasp will figure out how to get into like that tent the caterpillars have made and hunt the caterpillars inside of it, and they'll teach their nest mates how to go into that tent and pull caterpillars out. They can also hunt a ton. So here we have a study from New Zealand that was looking at a species of introduced social wasps and tracking how much are these guys actually hunting in a season. So they were tracking kind of one colony and looking at how much is it hunting per acre, so roughly the size of a football field. So they estimated that over the course of a season, this one wasp colony was bringing back almost 2 million individual prey loads. That is a wasp coming back with some kind of other bug prey. And that this equaled that the colony was harvesting 7.2 pounds of other insect protein in the area the size of a football field. So I don't know how much caterpillars weigh. I probably should, but like that's so many caterpillars to equal 7 pounds. So lots of hunting, lots of pest management is happening when we have wasps in an environment. So why do they become such a menace? So for our wasp hives, it's going to be only the queens that survive the winter. So at some point, the queens are going to peace out, and that is when things start to fall apart. There's less abundant protein. Eggs aren't being laid, so we don't have that like baby wasps give me protein and then the baby wasp produces sugar, like that falls apart. There's less protein available. And so all those workers, all those hunters, they're all going to die as soon as the frost hits. And I sometimes think maybe I shouldn't compare myself to wasps, but I sometimes think about when I'm stressed and it feels like my world is ending and my life is going bad, I turn to the sweet treats and the simple sugars. And our wasps kind of do the same thing. They're not getting that resource from their hive anymore. And that oftentimes brings them into direct contact with us. So they're looking for those simple sweets, simple sugars. So instead of going into our gardens and hunting caterpillars, they show up at our where we're drinking cider and trying to have a nice fall day. So good for part of the year, a menace for part of the year. But these guys have huge numbers in the fall. So instead of trying to get rid of the wasps, try to get rid of the food that they're attracted to if you're able. But not all wasps live like this. We have a whole other group of wasps called parasitoid wasps. They get their name because they're kind of like a parasite. They use usually another species of insect to complete their life cycle. These guys oftentimes are small and generic, and their whole point in their life is like to find an aphid or an egg or an emerald ash borer larvae, lay their egg inside of it, and then hijack that other bug to feed their young. So this is what it looks like. So here we have a parasitoid wasp, and it looks like it's stinging an aphid, but what it's actually doing is laying an egg inside of that aphid. So that egg is in the aphid, and once it hatches, there's going to be a baby wasp inside of that aphid eating it from the inside out. So this is not like aphid digestion. This is a baby wasp moving around inside of the now dead aphid. The aphid will die. It's a husk of itself. An adult wasp will emerge, and the cycle will repeat itself. So this is cool, a little freaky, a little sci-fi, a little the movie Alien, I guess, but very common in a lot of our systems in Minnesota and super helpful when we're trying to manage some of our most tricky pests. So I'm sure you've heard about emerald ash borer, a new invasive species, but one of the ways we're looking for managing emerald ash borer long term is to get parasitoid wasps. So we can go to where emerald ash borer is from, where it's part of the food web and it evolved with other insects, and we can find the tiny species of wasps who evolved alongside emerald ash borer. So we've discovered there are multiple species of parasitoids who lay their eggs in larval emerald ash borers or the eggs of emerald ash borers. And in the process of these wasps growing their numbers, they will be killing emerald ash borers. We've released over 600,000 of these parasitoids in Minnesota, and we're hopefully going to get some data soon. They were released a few years ago, and this year and next year, we're going to start getting data back about if these parasitoids are able to hang in Minnesota and might help us manage this bug. We have parasitoids that we've discovered and we're studying for things like brown marmorated stink bug. Maybe, I don't know, there's one in my kitchen right now, another common home invading insect. We have a parasitoid that will help us hopefully manage this bug in the future. Same with spotted winged Drosophila, that fruit fly that's ruining raspberries. We have a parasitoid that will hopefully help us manage it. So they're a really specific targeted insect that's super helpful for managing invasive species. Another helpful group of insects in Minnesota are called syrphid flies or flower flies or hover flies. The adults have evolved to look similar to bees. So they're yellow with black stripes. They hang out near flowers. Sometimes they like to hover by your sweaty arm. They've evolved to look like bees so that other insects leave them alone. But if we get a closer look, we can see they have the biggest giveaway is that they have ginormous eyeballs. One of the reasons flies are so good at like avoiding getting swatted is because they poured a ton of energy into having humongous, very reactive eyes. So if you're looking at the head of an insect, it's like, oh my God, it's all eyes, probably a fly. And the reason these guys are good is because the adults do a little bit of pollinating, but the larvae look like this. They look like, I don't know, a caterpillar. They kind of look like a booger. They're kind of gelatinous and green, but they're predators. So they are able to wiggle around and hunt aphids. And almost any aphid colony I find that has like more than 50 aphids in it, there is one of these guys who are in that aphid colony eating them. Last bug we'll talk about tonight are going to be ladybugs, maybe one of the most well recognized groups of insects in Minnesota. We have 50 species of ladybugs across the state that some live in forests, some live are associated with agriculture, lots of different ways these guys live, but all of them are predators of some type. And this is one where they have a complete life cycle, and all four parts of its life stage are visible to the naked eye. So being able to recognize these four life stages is helpful in that do I squish or not decision, because we might see these eggs, they're big and yellow, they kind of are shaped oblong like a piece of rice laid in a clump. We might be like, these are the eggs of a pest. But if we know that this is actually what ladybugs look like, we know, oh, if I leave these eggs alone in 5 to 7 days, I'm going to get an army of hungry baby ladybugs who are going to want to manage pests for me. This is what the pupa of a ladybug looks like. So it almost looks, I almost think it looks like a beanie, but it'll be like suction to a leaf and have a lumpy backside that is red and black. And if we see that, again, we don't want to squish it because in a few days we're going to have an adult ladybug who will help us manage pests. One question I get a lot is, are multicolored lady beetles, so the ladybugs that like to hang out on the side of our houses or maybe in our houses, are those guys still ladybugs? And the answer is yes. Just because they annoy us doesn't mean they're not ladybugs. And this bug is a nuisance, but they're also very helpful to agriculture. So we talked about soybeans earlier, so a crop that we grow a ton of in Minnesota. And one of the biggest pests of that crop is an aphid called soybean aphid. And what's nice about multicolored Asian lady beetle is that both the larvae and the adults are really, really good at eating soybean aphid. There have been some studies that have shown that farmers have to use less pesticides to manage this aphid because we have this ladybug around. So that doesn't solve everything, but for me at least, it takes away some of the sting as I'm like vacuuming up this bug and I'm like, well, it's in my house, but at least there's less pesticides being used in Minnesota because this bug is around. I'm trying to find a silver lining here because this is a bug that unfortunately is not going anywhere. So we'll close out. These helpful bugs in our garden. How do we attract them to our spaces? So both our pollinators and our predatory insects like flowers. A lot of their life cycle, some part of them, they like to eat and feed off of flowers. So having a variety of flowering stuff in our space is helpful. These bugs also need places to spend the winter. So leaving leaves, leaving stems, stuff that looks like mess to our eyes actually looks like a sweet overwintering crash pad for bugs. So leaving leaves, leaving stems, leaving things a little messy can be super helpful to bugs. Then anytime we can avoid using a pesticide, we're helping protect these guys because while we are trying to manage a fungus or an aphid, a lot of these products also have effects on the bugs we do want in our space. So some of our bugs are good, and we can support them being in our space. Okay, so that was like whirlwind, general overview of bugs. So all the different things bugs do in the space, how to recognize bugs, both good and bad, things to understand about insects you might want to manage because they're a pest, and things you might want to know about insects you might run into who are actually good. And that is all I have for tonight, but I'm happy to take any questions you guys have in the chat.
Thanks, Marissa. That was awesome. The first question was from Ruth. Can you talk about chiggers that bite gardeners? They recently have been a pest in the local area.
I don't run into chiggers too much as long as I'm not like picking black raspberries. Do you work much on that, think much about that, Emily?
Mm-mm, no.
I do not, but feel free to shoot me or Emily a question and we can have a more in-depth conversation about that one.
Another question from Ruth. Are the native ladybugs still out there? I only see the Asian variety now.
Yes, the native ladybugs are out there. Huh. Um, some it depends on what plants different species are evolved to be around and to eat pests in. One of the reasons we have so many of this multicolored Asian ladybill variety is that they feed on this aphid that is on soybeans, and we have so much so much soybeans in the state. Like it's very easy for that one to have a huge population because there's we plant the thing that gives them food, and we don't do that for a lot of our other ladybug species. So they are around. We don't always do a good job tracking their numbers. If you're interested in like ladybug populations and numbers, a really interesting participatory science project that was going on for a while was called the Lost Lady Beetle Project, but it was one where citizens helped report and identify ladybugs in their local area. So if you're like a ladybug hound and curious about their populations, that is a study I always found really interesting. It also has good resources for identifying ladybugs if you are like interested in going deep on that one particular bug.
Um, from Dylan. I need to know how to get rid of spider mites and keep them away,
Ooh,
but they keep getting into my grow room.
yeah, spider mites are super, super tricky. Especially again, they're like aphids where if it's hot and dry, spider mites really, really thrive. Sounds like this is like in an indoor space. So we're thinking about spider mites indoors. The biggest thing we can do is doing everything we can to make sure stuff we bring inside doesn't have spider mites on it. Now that can be really, really hard. Spider mites are, are really small, but good sanitation, which is like, rinsing off plants before they come inside, really closely inspecting any new plant you're bringing in so that they're not harboring spider mites is going to be your best bet because they're super, super hard to manage. Like once you notice them, especially once they're making the webs, there's almost, I want to say nothing, there's very little you can do once their populations grow. So I really rely on like sanitation, removing problem plants, those types of techniques. And I believe we have a web page on that that will highlight other stuff that we can pop in the chat for you.
Can you release lady beetle into your indoor plants?
Um, you could, but they would not be my first choice for a bug to release in my house. Um, Yeah. If you're thinking about adding predators to help you manage pests, there's a lot of tricks and nuances to that. It works much better indoors than outdoors. But if it's more of a home setting, I don't know if another live bug would necessarily be the route I would choose. But if I was going to go into it, I'd choose something like a lacewing that doesn't fly and is a little bit less mobile. But I would look towards yellow sticky cards and more of those types of tools to manage pests on a house plant as opposed to another bug.
This fall, a wasp nest was on my roof, and groups of maybe 3 to 5 wasps kept falling from it to the ground. What would have been going on?
Huh. Um, Depending on the type of year, I could see it being if it's kind of like at the tail of the year as things get cold, it might just be there are wasps trying to hunker down in that nest at night. And that nest, like some there's warm pockets and there's cold pockets, and as it gets colder and colder, I might bet you imagine what you're beginning to see is like it gets cold. Wasps in this part of the hive got too cold and died. The ones over here, they were insulated enough that night, but then the next night it's even colder, so then a few more die. I would suspect if it's at the end of the season, it is frost getting into that nest and starting to kill the workers who were never going to survive the winter no matter how hard they hunkered down.
Are crickets friends or foes, and do they eat slugs?
Um, I generally think of crickets as being mostly, well, I guess they're good. They're helpful in decomposing. I don't think of them as being slug eaters, so they definitely can. It's not like their most preferred source of food. Um, but I generally think of them as being like benign to good. Like if you're finding a lot of them in your basement, it like might give you the heebie-jeebies, but they might be telling you like, hey, seal up your basement. Something's wet down here. They might be like an indicator that something's going on in your basement. So I think of them as like good to whatever on the scale of all the bugs.
Is magnolia scale management possible?
Uh, that's a very tough one. I generally I don't do too much with trees. So that may be one where I point you to the extension website to learn more about that one. I don't know a ton about it, but what I do know is that it is it is tricky.
Shane used to know a lot about scale insects.
Ugh.
Um, I leave the stems and flowers of my echinacea over the winter. Should I have cut the dried flowers off to make it easier for the bees to use stems to overwinter?
Um, it's there's always when you think about like stem nesting bees, there's always kind of this lag where the bees that are hunkering down for the winter now, they are mostly in dead stems from 2023. So it's fine that you left your echinacea untrimmed if you're like want bees to be able to access it easier. If those tops don't break off in the course of whatever our Minnesota winter has in store for us, break them off in the spring. And the bees aren't active really until we have, a few days over 50 degrees. So they're not going to be out patrolling if you get out there and bust those stems in half, or they're looking for stems that are 8 to 24 inches long. So some level of trimming between now and when things are warm and bees will still be able to find those stems.
Okay, maybe a clarification here. I've heard that we should not squish Japanese beetles because it releases a pheromone, and just recently I read that this is not true. We can squish away without the pheromone bringing in more beetles.
Yeah, that pheromone is primarily a thing they release when they're alive. I don't know. Squishing them is kind of, they're so crunchy. You have to be very like, maybe you're full of like vengeful squishing energy. I like to bucket of soapy water those guys myself just because they're so hard. But if you're looking for that finger workout, they're squishable. But I'd lean more on the water. But yeah, it's fine to squish. No worries about smells.
I have a question for you. So when you talked about like the 30%, leaf damage, how many leaves at being at 30% leaf damage like on a plant would like negatively affect the plant? You know what I
Yes,
mean?
that's where it gets tricky because each plant is a little different. Our goals with each plant is a little bit different, but I think generally for most plants, just like overall 20 to 30% defoliation, with the caveat that like as long as that plant is getting like the nutrition it needs and the water it needs, and that damage isn't to the part of the plant that we care about, probably fine. But again, like it might be a plant we're growing for aesthetics and like we don't want the plants by our patio to be full of holes. Like that's fine. But like maybe we don't need to care that much about the plants that are like back by our garage that we never look at anyway. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of wiggle room, I think, when we're in more of a yard and garden space where our goal isn't yield. Our goal is aesthetics or enough tomatoes to can or whatever.
Hmm.
And yeah, so it can be helpful for that to like once you have a pest, there'll be more potentially more information about how much damage a plant can take related to that pest and that plant specifically.
Gotcha. Other questions from the attendees? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Marissa, for attending tonight and speaking. That was a terrific presentation. Very interactive, super good. So thank you. Just a reminder for everyone, I will send out the recording to your emails, and then I'll also post it on our YouTube channel if you ever wanted to watch it again. And once you leave this presentation, you'll be taken to a survey. So please complete the survey. And we do use all of that information that you provide during the survey to help us for next sessions. So with that, thank you everyone and have a good night.